Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we're gonna talk about ProxMox versus XCP-Ng. If you're new here, consider subscribing and leaving a like. Grab a cup of tea or coffee because this is gonna be interesting. And let's begin our journey to the ProxMox versus XCP-Ng discussion. So in this video, I'll go over the product history, then move on to the web interface usability, then cover all of the features included, and a roadmap for new features. Lastly, I'll let you know what I don't like about each product and how to choose one over the other. I'll be going through the text in this blog post, and I'll add my additional thoughts on anything that's interesting or that needs to be covered in a more detail. If you see any mistakes on the screen, I'll fix them after the video is released, because I wanted to publish this video early this week and just didn't have enough time to fix all of the issues with the text, because you know, life gets in the way. So now with all that covered, let's start with the history of XCP-Ng and ProxMox. And for XCP-Ng, it all started with Zen Orchestra in 2009. It was the first and the best web interface for Citrix Zen server. But then in 2017, Citrix decided to cut on some features of the free Zen server that they released on their website. And this was when Zen Orchestra team decided to release their own flavor of Zen server. They started a Kickstarter and their goal was to reach $1 million to kind of put together the open source version of Zen server that doesn't suck. And they have reached their goal fairly quickly, with people donating a lot more than they expected. So I think they collected 1.7 million or something like that, and they started to work on XCP-Ng right away. It turned out to be a very good project with a lot of interest from big tech companies. And now if you want to be running Zen server, go with XCP-Ng. It doesn't have any feature limitations that Citrix Zen server does. It's all free and open source, you don't have to pay for anything. But if you're a big company and you need that support, they offer it on xcpng.com website. Moving on to ProxMox history, it started in 2005 as a self-funded open source startup, because I don't remember if Kickstarter was already up and running in 2005 or GoFundMe or something like that. That's why they probably decided to go as self-funded. Development of ProxMox started when two Linux developers found out OpenVZ had no backup tool and no management UI. So they wrote that, and then KVM come into play a little bit later. So the first public release took place in April 2008, and the platform quickly gained traction. It was and is one of the few platforms providing out-of-the-box support for container and full virtualization, managed with a web-based user interface similar to commercial offerings. We are moving on to the functionality side. Both projects have web console for VM management, and let me show you how they look like. For example, in ProxMox, if you click on the host itself, you can see the CPU usage and you can even see the I/O delay. It helped me a lot with troubleshooting issues with VMs being slow, and in most of the cases it was a slow hard drive or hard drive that was dying. So this is a very good tool to troubleshoot if anything bad happens to your host. Because if your I/O delay constantly goes over 10%, and this is a test machine, mind you, so if it goes over 10% all the time, like all the time it sits at 40 or 30%, it's time to change for a faster disk or your disk is dying. You can track memory usage, server load, network traffic. You can leave notes about the host, manage local storage, do replication, and all that good stuff. If you switch to the VM view, you can see the memory usage, network traffic, CPU usage, and if you want to check the VM I/O, it's just down here. So if any one of your VMs is misbehaving, for example, maybe you caught the cryptovirus, the I/O will go up, and you'll be able to go back into logs and check when it happened and roll back to the required backup or snapshot. You have usual stuff for the VM, console, hardware, where you can change memory, processor, type of BIOS. Then we have cloud init section, options, task history, backups, replication, snapshots, firewall, and it's overall very extensive on features. I really like its web interface. So now let's switch to the Zen Orchestra web interface. And this is a little bit different and confusing at the same time. It wasn't straightforward at the beginning for me to understand and grasp all of the features, but with time you can learn all of that and you will never look back. For example, we can see which VM is turned on. You can have a filter for only running VMs, and in ProxMox there is no such feature. You can sort your VMs. This is a very good feature that I really like in XCP-Ng. And again, there's no such feature in ProxMox, because as you can see over here, every VM and container has its own number. And if you would want to sort them, you wouldn't be able to, because they are sorted by number and not by name. If we click on one of the VMs, we can see the quick stats over here. We can check more stats if you go to the stats tab. There's console, disks, snapshots, backups, logs, and advanced settings. And if you ask me, Zen Orchestra has more features in the web interface than ProxMox does, but I like the view of the ProxMox web interface more, just because it makes more sense to me. For example, fonts are much smaller by default, and I like that, because in Zen Orchestra you cannot fit as many VMs on one screen as you can in ProxMox. Okay, going back to functionality list, we have basic VM admin, yes, on both sides, and we can manage VMs with CLI, Web UI, and Windows app on the XCP-Ng side, and on the ProxMox we have CLI and Web UI. Live migration is supported on both platforms, but on ProxMox side, only VMs that are located on a shared storage are supported, and no cross-cluster migration supported natively as of yet. Live disk migration is supported on both platforms, VM high availability supported on both platforms, integrated console view supported on both platforms. Hyperconverged setup is a very interesting feature. And so XCP-Ng supports hyperconverged setup with help of internal project XOSen. It's not open source, and I don't think it's released for the latest XCP-Ng. At least the last time I checked, it wasn't. And on the ProxMox side, you can use Ceph for big clusters, or ZFS with replication for smaller clusters. For Ceph, for example, you need to have 3 servers up and running all the time. So your cluster should be at least 5 to 7 servers for you to use Ceph. For anything smaller than that, I wouldn't recommend Ceph at all. Just go ahead with ZFS and use replication. Automatic updates are supported on both platforms. Some limitations apply on the XCP-Ng side, because you can't jump easily from one minor version to another, as there are different upgrade instructions from the XCP-Ng team, and usually upgrades are done from ISO files instead of just regular Linux repositories. Thin provisioning is supported on both platforms, but on XCP-Ng side, thin provisioned images are only supported on NFS or ext3. iSCSI and LVM are thick provisioned, unfortunately. Something similar goes for ProxMox as well. You can have thin provisioned images when you are using ZFS or QCOW2 disk format, and you can refer to ProxMox storage wiki page for more information on that. ACLs and self-service are supported on both platforms, and they kinda go hand in hand with each other. So for example, if you want to give access to only one VM for a specific user, it is possible. And if they log into the web interface of either one of the products, they will only see that one VM on the list. That way, when you host a VM for a client, they have easy access to the VM's console. Scheduled tasks are supported on both systems, and two-factor authentication is supported on both systems as well. Moving on to the documentation. Both projects are mature enough for you to find answers to any possible question you may have. XCP-Ng has a lot of docs on the web thanks to Citrix Xen server forums and docs. Documentation from the project itself is decent, but it's more of a quick start guide rather than a manual. One of the good things is that XCP-Ng and Xen Orchestra are published on GitHub, so it's easier to file bug reports and track them. Another good one is that they use Discourse as their forum engine, but you need to register there if you want to search through the forums. And it's a real bummer, because once I had an issue with freshly updated system, and I had to register to search through the forums and check if anyone from the community had the same issue as I did. So remember, if you use XCP-Ng, go ahead and register to their forums, otherwise you will be stuck at the same situation I was, where your system broke at the worst possible time and you can't post the question quickly. Now, for the project like ProxMox, where it started in 2005, it has enough docs to cover almost all of the use cases out there. And they include and update the manual in HTML format with every installation. So if you want to check out the ProxMox documentation, just open up the web interface where your ProxMox is installed, click on documentation, and you're going to see a whole lot of docs in HTML, PDF, and EPUB formats. If I, for example, go here, you can see that we have hyper-converged infrastructure documentation, working with volumes, storage types, and all of that. So basically, they just exported their wiki and they include it with every installation of ProxMox. Which is a very good thing, because I know a lot of admins are disabling internet access on their hypervisors, just to add that another layer of security. So the documentation is there even if there is no internet at all. What's not so good is their Git system, which makes it harder to search for commits, look for undocumented features, etc. Just to give you a perspective on why I don't like it, as you may know, we are running MailCow in production, and I was looking for ways to make it highly available between two sites over the internet. So I went to their GitHub page and started to look for master-slave configuration, and I found the features that I was looking for, but they were completely undocumented in their wiki. Then, by just looking at the shellcode of the MailCow, I was able to single-handedly make it highly available and up and running within hours. Now let's move on to the section that you are all waiting for, advantages compared to each other. I'll go through XCP-Ng advantages first, and then finish off with ProxMox advantages. First advantage of XCP-Ng is project website modern feel and their marketing. XCP-Ng team is advertising heavily, which is a good thing. That way, they'll get more new customers. And from what I can see, the project is getting more and more traction. Fun fact, recently I had to download fresh ProxMox ISO, and I saw XCP-Ng Google ad that suggested that I download it instead. One of the groundbreaking features in XCP-Ng is cross-cluster resource migration, both for VMs and VDIs. For example, if you have two clusters, one Intel cluster with Cisco hosts, and the other cluster is HP with Ryzen, you can easily migrate resources between them, which is by default not possible in ProxMox. And you would have to play with third-party software from GitHub to achieve just that. I also feel like clustering in XCP-Ng is much more straightforward than it is with ProxMox. First of all, XCP-Ng supports up to 64 nodes maximum versus 32 nodes in ProxMox. Adding or removing machines from the cluster is much easier in XCP-Ng, where with ProxMox there is a whole procedure on how to remove the node from the cluster, and there are some limitations that you cannot add back node to the cluster with the same IP address that was already removed from the cluster or with the same DNS name. I've seen few posts on the internet that kinda allow you to overcome that issue, but still it's more manual labor, and you know that the manual labor is very expensive. XCP-Ng has a better backup management, and it also has standard import-export format with the OVA extension. General rule of thumb is that what's backed up in ProxMox can only be restored to ProxMox. Same goes for import. You cannot import a VM from VirtualBox or ESXi, but XCP-Ng doesn't have this issue. It can export any VM into an OVA archive that will be understood by the most virtualization systems out there, and it can import VMs from the same and more formats. I know that you can just export VMDKs or VDIs from the OVA archive and then use the converter in ProxMox to transform the disks into QCOW or RAW formats. But again, it's just a manual labor that could be avoided very easily by an automation script from ProxMox team. XCP-Ng has better network management directly from the UI. Configuring lag, management, VLAN, and other interfaces in XCP-Ng is a breeze. Every VLAN afterwards has a name that will help you understand what it stands for, which is helpful if you didn't touch the system for a while or if you have inherited it from someone. ProxMox is not even near that polished in this regard, and you'll have to read a lot. I mean, a lot. On Linux networking standards to understand how to separate management interface from a regular one. On the other hand, you'll learn a lot. And you will be more competent in the long run. But the question is, do you really need it? Because not everyone does. Let's be honest, most of us sysadmins, we are lazy people, and if we don't have to learn something additional, we consider it a win-win situation. For example, if I added a network interface on the ProxMox, I see the bridge name and I see the comment, for example, native bridge. But then if I choose a VLAN for it, I can't put a comment on a VLAN. And if I didn't touch the system for a month or two, I will definitely forget why that VLAN is even there. But in XCP-Ng, you can clearly see the network name. And if you go to hosts, then choose your cluster and click on networks, you can see each VLAN name. For example, this is VLAN 10 server, VLAN 12 CCTV, and so on and so forth. Another advantage of XCP-Ng is that it has many ways to backup VMs. Snapshots are available on any storage backend, and it has automatic scheduled snapshots. Something that's missing from ProxMox, by the way. VM listing filter in Zen Orchestra is just gorgeous. You can filter any resources like disks, VMs, networks, etc. You can use regular expressions. You can filter for running VMs, stopped VMs, VMs that are not backed up, and much, much more. In contrast, ProxMox only supports searching through the VMs in a list. For example, I can save a filter, I can set the filter to none, I can search for pending VMs, not running VMs, HVM guests, running VMs. I can even search through tags. And on ProxMox, the only thing that's available is a search bar over here that will filter down the VMs by name. There is easy on and off mode for nested virtualization in XCP-Ng. And you're gonna need to struggle for a bit to activate it in ProxMox. For example, I virtualized ProxMox under XCP-Ng to test some features, and if I want to do that, it's enough for me to go to Advanced tab and turn on Nested Virtualization, which means that I'll be able to run VMs in ProxMox as if it was installed on a regular hardware. And the last point is uptime and stability. I had much more success achieving huge uptimes with XCP-Ng. Sometimes I would even forget that there is a virtualization stack that I need to support. And it is a great thing, because it leaves me more time to do other things like writing blog posts, creating videos. ProxMox, on the other hand, is like a baby. It requires attention. One evening I was playing an online game with a friend. We used a TeamSpeak server that I'm hosting, and suddenly he said that my audio started to get flaky, and considering my audio setup it shouldn't. After some troubleshooting, it appeared to be a networking issue. ProxMox ChoroSync The clustering technology ProxMox uses on the backend started to push so much traffic through the VPN tunnel that my connection had a 60% packet loss. Imagine you have a 60% packet loss in an online game. This is a disaster. Coruscant crashed and started flooding a network with packets. This was the last time I considered clustering ProxMox nodes over the internet. If you have at least a glimpse of networking issues in your infrastructure, don't use ProxMox clustering at all. It will stab you in the back when you would least expect that. But it's not all that bad with ProxMox. It has some brilliant features that I will go over now. Starting with ZFS support. ZFS is one of the key features of ProxMox and why it is so popular. ProxMox natively supports clone, destroy, snapshot, and replicate features of ZFS. It can be installed on top of ZFS pool, which makes it easy to roll back from a failed update or configuration disaster. XCP-Ng, on the other hand, has only started its ZFS journey, and it has a lot of rough edges. There is no ability to install it on top of ZFS, there is no support for encryption, nor there are snapshot, destroy, and replicate features included. It treats ZFS as if it was a regular file system and not copy on write file system ZFS is. Let's just hope this will change with time, but it's very hard to predict anything due to how DOM0 in Xen works in general. The choice of storage is another big one for ProxMox. If you'd need to test a lot of storage backends, look no further than ProxMox. It supports ZFS, NFS, CIFS, Gluster, Ceph, LVM, LVM Thin, iSCSI kernel, iSCSI user space, and ZFS over iSCSI. If it doesn't support your storage backend natively, something like MuseFS or BFS, no worries, just install its agent from the terminal and mount it as you would mount it on a regular Linux system. Then go to ProxMox Web UI and tell it this is your new storage backend. Use it. XCP-Ng has limited options when it comes to storage, especially local, and it's not nearly as flexible. For example, in ProxMox, I can go to Data Center, Storage, then Add, choose a directory, give it a random ID, and then just specify a directory that needs to be used. Then specify a type of content you want to have there. I'll just specify all of that. You can mark it as shared and click Add. That's pretty much all you have to do to add unsupported storage backend to ProxMox. Okay, moving on, we have number of network interfaces per the VM. ProxMox supports up to 31, yeah, you heard that right, 31 network interfaces. Isn't that cool? Whereas XCP-Ng only supports 8. This was a deal breaker for us as a hosting company and for a few of our clients that are doing some similar things. Imagine the situation where you have to create a separate VLAN subnet for each client so they don't interfere with each other for security purposes, etc. So when I had to install few virtualized firewalls, the choice of virtualization platform was a no-brainer. And we used ProxMox for a fairly long time, but now we moved on to Beehive running on top of FreeBSD, but I'll cover that in another blog post or a video soon. Please don't mind the typo over here, I'll fix it after this video. ProxMox 6 is more or less a standard Linux distribution built on top of Debian 10. They just include a more modern kernel, web interface for KVM and LXC, and some internal CLI abstraction tools that make integration with KVM and LXC easier for the end user. So being a standard Linux distribution, it makes it a better choice for home labbers. At one point, my media center PC was a ProxMox host and media consumption machine at the same time. I just created a new user after default ProxMox install on top of ZFS. And then I installed GNOME 3, a couple of web browsers and media players, and it was good to go. It also worked like a charm for a long period of time before I could afford something bigger, better, or enterprise grade. XCP-Ng, on the other hand, is a very custom, purposely built system, which makes it nearly impossible to do something similar to the above, and it's a completely different story for another day. Okay, moving on to straightforward management. ProxMox has two ways of controlling it, CLI and Web UI, and it's more straightforward to configure. XCP-Ng, on the other hand, has three management interfaces, XCP-Ng Center, Zen Orchestra, and CLI. At this point you would think, wait, but the more options is better, isn't it? Well, in most cases you will be right, but not in this particular one. You see, not everyone has a Windows OS to install XCP-Ng Center on. For example, all of my personal machines are running either Linux or FreeBSD, and it's a real pain for me to install another VM to just run XCP-Ng Center on it. And it's effectively a waste of resources. Then the main problem is Zen Orchestra and XCP-Ng Center are not replacing each other. They rather complement each other. I'll give you an example. Most of the networking and cluster configuration can only be done from within the XCP-Ng Center. But most of the backups, VM management, filtering, resource monitoring is done from within the Zen Orchestra. It confuses a lot of people at the beginning when you start using XCP-Ng, but with time you get used to it. In all fairness, once the stack is configured, I rarely touch XCP-Ng Center, so think of it as an initial point of config. ProxMox has a native LXC container support. I wish there was something like that in XCP-Ng though. LXC containers are like Linux VMs, but they are more lightweight, easier and faster to deploy, and much more performant compared to the VMs. There is an option to install an add-on to Zen Orchestra that will show Docker containers in the web interface, but containers themselves would be running inside of CoreOS VM, and that can impact performance on the low-end machines. Also, when you're running a Docker stack and you have like 15 containers and just 3 VMs, it will be very confusing to see containers and VMs in the same interface. I tried it once and I'll say I didn't like it at all. There is no limit on number of the snapshots for the VMs and containers running on top of ZFS in ProxMox. But XCP-Ng, on the other hand, has a limit on the number of snapshots, which was inherited from the Zen server. It's around 30 per VM. I couldn't find the exact number in the documentation, but I know it by a practical example. One day I configured daily, weekly, hourly, and yearly snapshots on one of my VMs, but after some time Zen Orchestra started to send me notifications that snapshots were failing. And after a short investigation, I figured out that I could only keep around 30 snapshots per VM, which is a real bummer in 2020. ProxMox running on top of ZFS, for example, is able to keep this number of snapshots. So by the time you reach that limit, there will probably be a YFS, or yottabyte file system, that will come to the rescue. I just hope that somebody else than Oracle will develop it due to the licensing issues. You know, Oracle. ProxMox has virtually no limit on disk sizes for the VMs. It's 2020 now, and XCP-Ng still can't manage to create a virtual disks for VMs that are bigger than 2 terabytes. I know there is development going on right now to overcome this issue, and at least developers listened to the community. Citrix, for example, has forums full of the posts with this feature request, but they are all either unanswered or left ignored. ProxMox has firewall rule management integrated directly into the UI. I don't use this too often, but this is a very useful part of ProxMox. For example, when the guest OS has a weird firewall implementation that you're just not in the mood to learn, or the appliance doesn't have a firewall at all, just click on the VM or container you want to configure, go to firewall settings, and start filtering that traffic. It also supports rate limiting. In XCP-Ng, you can only limit the guest OS interface speed. No firewall rules can be applied. For example, if I go to ProxMox web interface, I can click on firewall and add a new rule that will have a direction, action, interface, etc. So again, another useful feature when you want to manage firewall directly from the web UI in ProxMox. By the way, this is based on IP tables in case you are curious. Every ProxMox installation includes a web interface. Then, when it comes to ProxMox cluster and one server has a fault, and you were connected to that server via the web interface, just type in the IP address of another server in a cluster and you'll gain a full control over all resources once again. XCP-Ng, on the other hand, is not that easy. After the default installation, you can deploy a free version of Zen Orchestra, which is very limited on features, by the way. And you can only deploy it inside of the VM, or you can install XCP-Ng Center on one of your Windows machines. But remember, in the end, you'll require both XCP-Ng Center and Zen Orchestra. For example, I keep these two VMs just for the management of my XCP-Ng cluster. Moving on to the last advantage on the list, two-way delta replication of the local storage. There is a delta replication option in XCP-Ng, but it works only one way, which is a shame. For example, we have a VM on ProxMox at location A, we need to replicate it to location B, and we'll use ZFS replication for that. VM is 5 GB. First time we'll have to transfer all of that, but every time after that, only the bits that changed are transferred. This is one-way replication. There is the same option in XCP-Ng, so all good so far. The difference comes when you need to start a VM at location B, change some files, work on it, etc. for the disaster recovery situations or something similar. Then location A comes back online, and the only thing we need to do is shut down the VM at location B and migrate it back to location A. Only the bits that were changed are transferred. Where with XCP-Ng, you'll have to transfer back a whole VM again. I mean, for 5 GB VM is not so bad, but imagine it was 10 TB. Now that's a disaster. If you want to read on this more from the documentation on Zen Orchestra, just Google Zen Orchestra backups, then scroll down to backup, continuous replication, and read on it in case you're curious. Something that I didn't cover in a blog post as of yet is features that I'm missing from both projects. For example, I'm missing storage encryption. None of the projects support native REST encrypted volumes, and it was one of the main reasons I moved to Beehive running on FreeBSD. Another big one for me is less resource usage. DOM0 inside of XCP-Ng will use anywhere between 2 and 5 GB of RAM, and the more replication jobs in ProxMox you have, the more memory it will consume as well. Another feature that I'm missing is flash drive installation. Both ProxMox and XCP-Ng are writing logs, RRD graphs, etc. to local storage. This makes it difficult to install them on a regular USB flash drive because they will die soon. I saw on the ProxMox forums that one guy tried it, and he ran ProxMox in RAID 1 configuration on 2 flash drives. They both died in about 6 months. So I would love to see an option to move such random writes for logs and graphs to the external storage, like it is in FreeNAS or TrueNAS. And just another minor inconvenience is around notifications about missing subscriptions in ProxMox and Zen Orchestra Open Source Edition. I know what my setup is. Stop screaming about it, please. It's a home lab. For example, if I refresh the page in Zen Orchestra, it will show me the stop bar every time. Now, some final thoughts on why you would choose one project over the other. And as always, the choice is yours, but remember, there is no clear winner here. If you are a Windows admin, XCP-Ng will be easier for you. You'll have your buttons and windows and all that good stuff that you can't live without. ProxMox, on the other hand, is rather for a red-eyed Debian sysadmins that love to live in a shell and are afraid of the daylight. I'm just joking, but with all seriousness, the stack choice will depend on the problem you want to solve. Is your storage just an old-fashioned iSCSI on a SAN? Then choose XCP-Ng without any hesitation. It has a better support for iSCSI with multipathing, snapshots, and so on. Need LXC containers and a lot of storage choices, hardware pass-through, custom network settings, and easy access to firewall for each VM or container? That's a job that ProxMox will handle very well. Let me know what is your hypervisor of choice down in the comments below. point out anything I missed in the video or anything that was fixed in one of the projects recently. I'll try to upgrade video description or a pinned comment to reflect all of the latest changes. But that's it for now. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing, donating, sharing, and all that good stuff. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.